Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss the fight over the EU's next long-term budget that is called a fracas, or as they say in French, fracas. Is that right?
Yes, that's great.
In the European Parliament. We will also talk about a flurry of EU policy activity happening this fall. Then we will turn to a conversation with the great Jeremy Shapiro, who's the research director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, to discuss how European leaders have approached Trump. Have they avoided the worst-case scenario, or is appeasement backfiring already? Donatien, let's talk about the EU budget. There's a huge budget fight happening right now here in Washington. The government is shut down. What is this EU budget about? When is this budget going to take place? Maybe give us some background on what's happening with this fight.
Yeah, it's pretty funny to compare the two tracks here, US and EU, because the negotiations that are happening right now in October 2025 in Brussels are about the budget that will start in 2028. That's because it's going to last until 2034. There are 7-year increments for these massive European budgets, although massive, obviously we can have a debate around that. So it must feel kind of quaint from the US perspective, like they're talking about it 3 years ahead. But they have to, because there's a lot to be negotiated.
But I think let's just be clear to the listeners. This is insane.
What part?
I think negotiating a budget 3 years out and then having that budget last for 7 years because, nothing really happens in the course of time, especially over 7 years. The last time they negotiated this was 2020, and they were totally expecting Russia to invade Ukraine.
Well, even in 2020, when they were getting close to the start of the 2021-27 budget, they had to rework a lot of the assumptions that had been made because there was this little thing called COVID that was unfurling everywhere. So they had to readjust a lot of the priorities. But in this one, I think they heard what you're saying a little bit. Obviously, you could say it's a little bit crazy to try to plan so much ahead. But it's driven by big lines of efforts that are unlikely to change for the next 5-10 years. But at the same time, they're trying to build in more flexibility into the budget. It's not entirely clear to me what that looks like exactly. There's some conversation around a flexibility instrument because Brussels loves nothing more than an instrument or a fund and a proliferation of them. But briefly, on this budget, the way it starts is the Commission puts something on the table. So they'll say it's kind of like here when you have the president's budget that is produced first, and then obviously Congress does its thing. Here,
ignores it and then does what Congress is going to do most of the time.
It's a little different, though, in Brussels. The Commission's budget drives more of the conversation, even though Parliament obviously has a co-legislating responsibility. But to give our listeners just the meat of this and why there's so much debate around this at the moment, especially in Parliament, is von der Leyen's Commission proposed a budget that is now organized around 4 main categories. They call them headings. For ease of understanding, we can call them categories. For context, the previous budget had 7. Headings can change. They changed from the previous MFF to this one, which is the multi-annual financial framework, from the previous 7-year budget to this 7-year budget. So change itself in the headings is not the biggest deal. What's a big deal here is that the proposed budget combines big lines of effort that were separate before. 2 of these represent about 2/3 of the current EU budget. That's the agricultural policy, the farmers you love to talk about who are always in Brussels.
I love the farmers.
With their trucks and blocking the streets. And what they call cohesion funds or regional funds. This is meant to really help all kinds of different poorer regions across the European Union level up, because there's a recognition that they came into the union with very different socioeconomic conditions.
And maybe just a quick point on both of these. And both of these are sort of critical to the broader European project, have been around for a long time. The common agricultural policy was sort of critical to create a single market or create a common market, because if you're going to open up competition between European countries, the farmers wanted to be protected and subsidized. We sort of do something similar here in the United States. It's fairly common. Hence, agriculture is oftentimes a major thorny issue in global trade agreements. And cohesion policy has been really critical to getting money to southern Italy or other parts of Europe that have historically been left behind. Just a quick side note. I had a professor at the London School of Economics, Roberto Leonardi, if I remember correctly his name, who I think really picked the best topic in the world, where he said he was going to focus on European cohesion policy in Southern Europe. And so he would travel to like the islands of Italy and Southern Spain
smart man.
and Greece. And so great focus line of effort for any of those who want to focus on cohesion policy as their PhDs. It
He
makes
didn't
a lot
want
of
to go
sense.
like rural Poland.
Yeah,
Or...
he picked the Southern European end. But so they're going to combine these into
Yes.
one. And what's sort of the idea here?
The idea would be right now there's plans for each parts of these cohesion funds of the agricultural policy. And a lot of it, especially for cohesion, is decided with the regions. But there's a lot more power that rests at the regional and local level at the moment. What the Commission is proposing is that there would now be what they call national and regional partnership plans that would allocate a piece of that funding, but the capital would have a lot of the power in designing this. Obviously, the Commission says it would be in collaboration with the Commission, national capitals, regions. But the way it's designed right now, and a lot of the criticism that's coming up, honestly, it kind of sidelines the regions, which means there's a lot of power concentrated at the national level. And in some places, it probably isn't a big deal. In other places, there's concerns that some regions could be left behind, or it could be used against political opponents.
But so why is the Commission trying to do this? Because they know this is going to be a political hot potato. I mean, my understanding is what they're really seeking to do here is they're trying to squeeze any sort of flexibility out of what little money they have. Now, we think of the EU as this big sort of regulatory colossus. It has a tiny little budget. And that budget is largely provided by every country in the EU. 1% of your GDP, if you're a European country, goes to the European Union. That actually doesn't add up to all that much. And there's all these things that the European Union wants to spend on, whether it's defense, whether it's grid connections, energy policy, things like that. So it's trying to find more funding, right? Is
Yes.
that the central idea?
That's part of it. The stated goal is also simplification of the budget. Behind that, obviously, behind that door lies potentially more flexibility in pushing some things around. That's part of the criticism, is that not only are they bucketing agricultural policy and cohesion funds, they're also reducing the total envelope that is allocated to this. The Commission would say no, but that's the contention at the moment, so that they can allocate more money towards some of the other categories, especially the one on competition, competitiveness, and prosperity. That's the Draghi report, that's industrial policy, that's growth and productivity. And that would be a big like European competitiveness fund that the Commission is really touting. That would be like 400 billion euros. It's quite massive. Within that is also defense and space related funding at about 130 billion euros. So there's a big, big ambition that comes behind this. The problem is the ambition is not coming, as you were saying, with a massive increase in the total budget. The EU budget for this 7-year budget is about 1.1% of gross national income across the European Union. It's not a ton. And so they have to work within some of those constraints, and moving things around is how they've managed to do it. I think it's valuable. There needs to be some movement in how the European Union supports competitiveness and change like this, including its place in the world and development and peace, etc. The challenge is, one, they say simplification, but they seem to be creating new funds and instruments. We're going to need some clarification there. And two, there's already criticism coming out of multiple places, including the Court of Auditors, that this system makes it much harder to track the money. And we already know there's abuse of EU funds in several places, and that's a serious concern. And when we're thinking in a time of populist gain, you want to be able to tell citizens, we know where your money is going, we know the ultimate recipients, but these like national and regional partnership plans make that much harder. So they're going to have to answer a lot of questions there.
On that, I mean, oftentimes I'm critical of some of our Northern European friends being reluctant to support broader EU proposals. Here, I think part of what we're going to see in this ongoing debate is the need for greater accountability for the money that the EU provides. The New York Times years ago did this great investigative report on Hungary and how it spends EU funding, and how it was basically the EU was just giving money to further Orban's corruption. And the problem is then, how do you prosecute the misuse of EU funds? Well, you don't really have a collective EU law enforcement. They've created prosecutors' offices, but that has to be approved by the member states. So Hungary would have to say yes, basically, to having a prosecutor go and investigate wrongdoing, and they have not agreed to. Some countries have. But I could see as part of what is going to happen is an increase in, for this budget to go forward, or when this budget goes forward, demands that, okay, we're going to be much more accountable for all the EU money that is spent. But the broader problem here is if you're going to be subsidizing farmers, okay, fine, subsidize farmers. The cohesion policy, there's questions of its efficacy. I think in general, it's historically been, I think, a quite successful policy. It'd be hard to sort of get rid of it, but you need more money. So you can either cut certain things, fight the farmers, fight the regions, or you can figure out new ways to get revenue to fund pan-European public goods such as defense and energy. And so I think this is where there's a lot of twists and turns that we're going to see in this fight that's going to take place in the next few years.
I should say the Commission also offered ideas for these resources, what they call own resources, which is something that Brussels raises without basically the member states sending money their way. But there's questions around how realistic some of these are.
I mean, it's the basic problem is like the EU can't send out tax credits or checks to every European taxpayer. That's not how it works. It doesn't have that same sort of IRS federal control. So how does it raise revenue? Does it get some money from tariffs? There's ways that it can sort of increase it. But I think this is going to be a big question.
For sure. And maybe to get into one of the bubbling topics in Brussels now around investment, they also are facing the beginning of repayments for Next Gen EU for this big COVID fund or like crisis fund that will start in 2028. And for that, there needs to be more investment in the EU. And I think you have some thoughts or at least some trepidation about some things we heard out of Germany.
Yeah, maybe to back up for a second. I think this fall, as we entered this sort of semester, there was this sort of general sense of disillusion within the EU. They had bent the knee to Trump. Progress on implementing the two big reports from the European Union from last fall, the Enrico Letta report on the single market and the Mario Draghi report on competitiveness. Action didn't seem all that significant. Draghi gave this big speech right as we sort of entered September, admonishing the EU for being sort of asleep at the wheel and not acting. There's think tank reports saying, I think roughly only 10% of the Draghi report has been implemented. Von der Leyen then gave a State of the Union speech, which said, no, we're still committed to the Draghi report. And I think we're starting to see signs of movement here. And in particular, one of the main things that the Draghi report called for is something called, as we've talked about on the show, the Capital Markets Union. And what is the Capital Markets Union? Well, it's in some ways sort of boring, but it's basically how do you integrate the financial sector? So here in the US, we have the Security Exchange Commission. We have, it's one supervised regulation on how our capital markets work. And so we operate as sort of one country. So we have huge venture capital pools, private sector can raise a whole bunch of money, and we have an integrated financial sector in Europe in an integrated stock exchange. So one of the big obstacles here is Germany has been rather reticent about this and has not really wanted to move and have more centralized European control. And while there is a common body, the European Security Markets Authority, ESMA, doesn't really have the kind of authority and lawmaking ability or law enforcement capacity of the SEC in the US. It's more of just a coordinating body. And what we saw over the last few weeks is a real shift in Germany, starting with the finance minister, Lars Klingbeil. He shifted in remarks noting that Germany would be open to sort of shifting authority more to the ESMA. And also, Friedrich Merz gave a speech to the parliament calling for a European stock exchange, which is a basic way for, I think people to more easily grasp what this is, to create a common European stock exchange. And therefore, Europeans save a lot of money, but that money gets sent over into the US to get bigger returns and doesn't really get reinvested into Europe. And that means that if you're a startup company in France or in Spain, it's really hard to raise capital. And oftentimes those startups will try to move to the US because then you can really raise a lot of money. So this is really important when you think about European competitiveness because it's about raising big pools of private money that can then be directed into certain companies and can help build really big companies that can then change the world or produce growth. And so I think what's important here is there's movement, real movement. And apparently what Germany and France are looking at getting on the same page before a December European Council summit meeting. And, there's going to be countries that don't like this, like Luxembourg and Ireland, that really benefit from a kind of fragmented European landscape. And this is true, this is what we see on all sorts of issues where there are certain bespoke interests or certain interests in various small countries or sectors that, are nervous about what would be the fallout of integration, because that would create some efficiencies, it would create some losers. So we'll see how this progresses, but I think there's real movement there.
There is. And yes, some smaller member states will have issues with this, but it's critical for the largest one to start shifting. Like Merz saying what he did was really, really important. I think we should say also just the personal connection between the French side and the German side played a big role. And I think even with the transition in the French government, the new Minister of Economy is unlikely to shift that position. So there's a lot of like center-left connections there that will be really valuable. The one thing I will keep my eye on here is the effort behind this will try to get behind like less fragmentation, as you said, and lower compliance costs. But I think some banks will also try to keep pushing for reduction in regulation. And they really need to keep their eye on this because it shouldn't be we abandon a lot of things because there still needs to be a lot of regulation on the banking system. But there really could be a massive injection of funds that helps with growth and productivity.
Yeah, but I think what this hits at is that we are oftentimes, the narrative is Europe is divided, nothing is happening. I mean, it looks like there's real movement here. And maybe finally, we've also seen that there's final agreement on the European Defense Investment Program, which is only really governs 1.5 billion euros right now, but it really sets the stage for when the EU is going to have a much larger defense budget, which is likely coming in the next 7-year budget. And that is really important because what it did is identify how much third parties, so if you're the United States and you're a company, are you eligible and you have to hit certain thresholds. And there was a lot of back and forth. The EU ironed out an agreement there. And then also, I think just today, there was an announcement that EU energy ministers, through a qualitative majority vote, didn't put a sanction on Russian energy, but basically phased out purchasing Russian fossil fuels by 2028. And because they did this as energy ministers and not as a form of sanction, it means that they could do it by QMV, i.e. they could work around Hungary and Slovakia. And so whenever we say, oh, the EU stuck because of Hungary and there's Slovakia, well, they find a way. And with that, I think we'll transition to our conversation with Jeremy Shapiro.
We're thrilled to welcome Jeremy Shapiro to the Eurofile. Jeremy is the research director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. His area of focus include U.S. foreign policy and transatlantic relations. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm not entirely clear that I'm Europhile.
It's file with an F, Jeremy. You cover the Euro files.
I do cover the Europhile, yeah. I like to think I maintain a professional distance, though.
So let's start big picture. We're going to talk a lot about how Europe is approaching President Trump these days and whether maybe things are backfiring. So we've seen a lot of attempts to engage with this administration from the European side, maybe appease, some would say, instead of full-on confrontation, because of course there's a lot of incentives to do so on the trade side, on the Ukraine side. What's your evaluation of how different European leaders have approached the Trump administration about 10 months into this? And are we seeing different buckets of approach, or do you think it could have gone a different way?
Well, by and large, I think that they have come together on an approach. It's, I guess, one of those rare cases of European unity. And I usually advocate for it, but I think in this case, it's not such a great idea. And they are consistent with what you said, I think, broadly taking what I call the appease, distract, delay approach. The idea is that Trump is crazy and dangerous for Europeans, particularly because Europe is so dependent on the U.S. in both the trade and security realms, especially the security realm. And therefore, standing up to him, having a blow up with him is a really bad idea. And it's very easy to do. They did it a few times during the first term, and the reporters jump on it. It's a problem in their domestic politics because people think they aren't protected. So they really want to have a good meeting with Trump. Turns out it's not that hard to have a good meeting with Trump. It's deeply humiliating. It's embarrassing. It erodes your will to live. but it's not difficult to do. All you have to do is flatter him to the skies, maybe have a military parade, a brief flyover by expensive aircraft, and you're fine. He doesn't really care that much about the policy that you discuss. And so you have this good meeting, you have a good press conference. The press doesn't say that you have a disastrous relationship with the United States, and you can go home. The problem is you haven't solved or even really addressed any of the problems that you have with him. What you're trying to do, you appease him, you have a good meeting, you delay decisions, you distract him with other issues, and you hope that the administration ends or he dies, or maybe we're all consumed in a nuclear holocaust and you never have to deal with it. This is the sort of politician's mantra, right? Why do today what I can put off for tomorrow? And so they've been doing that. But I think they have a big problem with this, which is that in the first instance, Trump appears pretty healthy. In the second instance, nuclear war doesn't seem too likely. And in the third instance, it's not entirely clear that Trump is sui generis in US politics and things might continue. Worst of all, what is happening is that by taking this appeasement strategy, they are conveying to Trump and to his administration and to any successors that they're weak and dependent and that you can take their support for granted. And so what Trump has been doing over and over again is coming back for more every time. And I feel as if the Europeans should have learned this by now. Arguably, they have learned it. I mean, when you talk to them offline, they admit all of this stuff, but they say, well, what else are we going to do if we have this blow up? It's a disaster. If Trump withdraws his security commitment to Europe, it's a disaster. So they don't feel like they have much choice.
Maybe just to pick up on that. I mean, it really seems that European leaders, if there's a strategy, it's to sort of say whatever they can to Trump, flatter him, but bide their time. They're sort of delaying a reckoning. In the meantime, therefore, they're supposed to be taking said action to reduce their exposure. It seems like you don't see that much happening on that side. And my view is that I see some stuff. I think we're talking about frozen Russian assets for Ukraine because there's a recognition that Europe's going to have to finance that. The EU looking at trade agreements with Indonesia, India, trying to diversify away. But how do you see it? Are the Europeans pursuing a strategy of kind of strategic autonomy decoupling at the same time they're flattering Trump?
Yeah, I broadly agree with you, Max, just because it's easier that way. But I guess I think that the problem is you can say, well, what we're going to do is appease, delay, and distract. And in the background, we're going to build autonomy in the 4 years. And you're half right. They're doing some of that. To be clear, talking about assets is not doing anything. Like actually seizing assets would perhaps be doing something. So color me skeptical until they actually do it. But yeah, I mean, there's some things going on. In terms of trade, as you said, there's some things going on, arguably, in terms of defense spending. But, I mean, well, there's definitely things going on with defense spending. It's not clear that they're building autonomy with it. And I guess that's what gets at the issue. The idea of building autonomy and creating a degree of independence from the United States, a degree of leverage from the United States, is a very politically fraught and expensive task within Europe. And you can't do it in secret, right? You have to build a societal consensus for that. And what keeps happening is they appease, they delay, distract Trump, and then they go out the back door and say, well, let's maybe not buy so many American weapons, or let's construct a trade deal with Indonesia so we have more leverage with the Americans. And everybody in their domestic politics is like, well, why do we need to do that? We just had a good meeting with Trump. We don't need any of these things. These things are expensive and they're politically fraught. So in my mind, it's the temptation of all democratic leaders, but you should live your truth, right? If you need to build autonomy, build a political support, a political foundation for building autonomy, and then you'll move faster and more clearly. And they're definitely not doing that. And I think that explains why the stuff they're doing at the back door is, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Some of it's good, some of it's not, doesn't seem to progress, all that stuff.
But is it your sense really that they're not building that with their own publics? Because in a lot of polling that we see, people are quite supportive of a more European defense.
Honestly, stop reading polling on questions like this.
It's relevant because there is some support at the public level for decoupling from the United States.
Sure. There's always been support at the public level for decoupling from the United States. The problem is that this is fundamentally a leadership elite task because they have to pay the piper. I mean, if you ask somebody in a public poll, do you prefer to be independent from, I don't know, your mother-in-law yeah, then everyone will say yes. But if it turns out that your mother-in-law holds the mortgage to your house, that's not really a very relevant statement. The European leaders need to be willing to devote political capital, devote political spending to this thing. Yeah, they have a permissive domestic condition. They've always had a permissive domestic condition for this. Sovereignty is popular, but they haven't really done it because they don't want to pay the political cost, and they have to be willing to pay that political cost. And I see, again, mixed evidence of that. There's some of it varies a bit across Europe. I think it is growing slowly because there is this sort of recognition that Trump and perhaps future American administrations are unreliable. But overall, I think it's still so expensive and they have so many budgetary problems and political problems that in most countries, France is an exception, but in most countries, they're not diving into this. I think you see this most clearly in Germany, which is really like ricochets back and forth between this. It's clear what they want to do in the minds of leaders. I mean, Merz, enters office and basically says, well, gee, we got to deal with the United States in a very different way. And then he doesn't do it. So I think we know what he thinks of Donald Trump, even though he's never said it. But I don't see him really being willing to spend the political capital. Whereas, I think with Macron, you see much more willingness to spend some political capital on this issue.
I think one of the questions here for Europe, right, is that the security relationship, U.S. commitment to NATO, was sort of in its own policy track. It was sort of in a protected tunnel, never really interfered with whether we're fighting about chlorinated chicken or tech regulation. But now there's no protected track. It's all sort of interconnected in some ways. And I think what is confusing, and I think the administration itself is confused. I don't think there's a coordinated strategy here. But it's clear the EU felt that they were making concessions over and made a trade deal with the US that the Commission would have never agreed to. It's not WTO compliant. There's non-reciprocal concessions, but they're doing so because of the security relationship. And so I guess the question is, if the Europeans start doubting the security relationship, then why pay for a service, which the way Trump sort of views NATO is like you pay up for the protection that we're providing. But if it seems pretty clear, with a forced posture review and other things coming out that we're not going to provide that protection, why pay? You're going to fire your provider if they're not providing the service that they're. Okay, so is what you're advocating that European leaders should just need to be stronger about the kind of domestic policy fights that they're having with the administration, and then just let the chips fall on the security side because it's kind of going to happen anyway? How should European leaders proceed here?
Look, I think that right now the Europeans have not given up on the security relationship, and so they're still willing to make sacrifices for it. And even though they're nervous about it, there's enough of them who believe that delay and distract will work, appease, delay, and distract will work. There's enough of them who believe that there's just no alternative, that there is no European alternative. I know that you don't believe that. I only believe it on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I'm sure there's an alternative. So that, that they're still playing that game. So as of yet, they haven't gotten there. And I think it's going to have to be clearer than clear for them to do it. I think the way that I put it in a paper is Europeans will never emerge voluntarily out from under the American security blanket. Someone will have to pull it off of them. That someone is, pretty likely to be Donald Trump, but he hasn't done it yet. Yeah. He hasn't quite done it. Maybe the posture review will, but I suspect the posture review will be like a little bit of bad news, but not catastrophic news from a European perspective. Could have been worse. Yeah, it was still something we can do. But I mean, I agree with you. They should be, to my mind, this is a matter of time. What they should be doing is starting from today to reduce the leverage. Actually, to my mind, they should have started in, 2014. And if they had started in 2014, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. They'd look more like India or China negotiating with the United States than like the EU. And again, they have done some things, but the last 10 years, they spent a fair amount of money and it was wasted in terms of security autonomy. Adam Tooze had a few months ago a very interesting article in the Financial Times where he pointed out that, there was $1 trillion in extra spending in Europe in the last 10 years on defense, and they still don't seem to have anything to show for it. So they can waste another $1 trillion if they have to. I mean, if you need to waste $1 trillion, your first call should be to Lockheed Martin. And that's where their first call was. So I think they should be doing this right now because eventually I believe they will get to where you're saying, and they'll be in a better place. They will be able to negotiate more effectively on the trade front if they're more independent on security. Somewhat separate topic, but I've just finished a paper on how to rebalance the relationship so that you can sort of say to the Poles and the Brits, we're not getting rid of the Americans. We're just rebalancing it so that we can have a better capacity to negotiate with them on both the security and trade front. I modeled it after Gwyneth Paltrow's concept of conscious uncoupling, which is her alternative to divorce. And I think Guru Gwyneth has a lot to teach us about transatlantic relations. So what I'm advocating is not divorce, it's conscious uncoupling.
The NATO summit, I think, was a prime example of this, where I think European leaders left The Hague being like, oh, we did it. Success, like we kept the alliance together. But then they didn't really pay attention to a comment that Trump made about Article 5, which is, I think, the Europeans have not quite internalized, which is that Article 5, as Trump said, it depends on your definition. So I think Trump has sort of been briefed that like, oh, if Poland invoked Article 5 because the 21 drones coming into Polish territory, you could argue was the largest attack on NATO soil since its founding. But the U.S. is not actually obligated to go to war for anybody. And I think the European conception is that, like, yes, it is. Like, that was the whole thing, is that the U.S. fights. Whether Portugal or not, sends some ammo or gets in it doesn't really matter. But the U.S. is there. But now you could see a situation where the U.S. sort of is adhering to Article 5 and doing what we do to support Ukraine. And I think that wasn't really our kind of evolving conception, or Trump's evolving conception of how he sees Article 5 and his commitment to the alliance. It's one thing to have troops on the ground, but another is like, what is the president then willing to do in order to, but there's this tendency to want to see the glass being half full and America still is, still there.
No, I agree with you. It's just that I'm a little bit sympathetic to the Europeans on that. I mean, first of all, this is, even though Article 5 really, in terms of its words, is closer to Trump's interpretation, it had evolved over the last 80 years before he showed up into this absolute commitment to go to war with the full strength of not just American conventional power, but, nuclear war. I mean, on a certain level, we had pledged, not in the treaty, but over the course of these decades, to destroy America in order to save Europe. It was that level of commitment. And I think up until President Trump, it really was. So I can understand why they are still trying to cling to that. I just think that, let's take the measure of the man. Commitment is not a word that Trump remotely understands. I think you can tell by the 3 marriages and the fact that he doesn't even really seem to trust his children, that he isn't bound by any previous commitment. I mean, if anybody who thinks that a commitment that Trump makes is valuable 2 days later, I think probably went to Trump University. This is ridiculous stuff. I mean, his entire career belies the notion of commitment.
The one thing, though, is that Europeans also made huge commitments to now spend more money on defense. The UK and France in particular to spend 3.5% on defense in the next 4 years. I think they're in real trouble because, Spain got the crap beaten out of them by all the other Europeans for not being on the same page and not being with the program. I think the Trump folks are going to follow up extensively, constantly, with a huge stick, beating the UK and France and others, being like, well, you've increased defense spending by 0.01% because they have no money to spend. So it seems like Europeans are also making some commitments here that like, maybe they want to meet them.
I suppose that's true. I mean, the delay distract thing is like, let's get out of this NATO summit, pledge 3.5 and 1.5, and as if it actually mattered, right? I mean, first of all, as is discussed endlessly by experts like us, these sort of arbitrary GDP numbers are not actually that interesting for defense. What's really interesting is what capabilities you create with that money and what autonomy you create with that money, therefore what leverage. I think that Europeans decided in trying to appease Trump that rather than create important capabilities and autonomy, to be fair, there's some variation within the Europeans on this question, but they were going to try to use that extra defense spending to lock the Americans in rather than to create autonomy and capability. And so the logic of that is interesting if you think about it, because you're going to try to lock the Americans in. Well, if you lock the Americans in, there's no way you need to spend 3.5%, right? Because the Americans are there. They could beat the Russians with one arm tied behind their back. And all you would need to do is send a congratulations telegram. So you end up in this sort of weird thing where if you succeed at keeping the Americans in with the spending, you don't need the spending. So the idea is, I think, you send a lot of it to American defense contractors, create some constituency for that within the Congress and within the administration. And then you fail to achieve the 3.5%, but you get enough spending to lock the Americans in, or at least to entice them in. You can see that in the last 5 years, the amount of European defense spending in America, U.S. procurement, has just gone through the roof. And right now, Europe is the biggest region it's up, I think, 105% in the last 5 years. Obviously, this has to do with increased spending, but I think it also has to do with a change in the way that they're deploying their defense spending. And this is the big argument between, the French and the Germans, which is like the French say, well, let's build a defense industrial base. Let's build autonomy. Let's build European projects. And the Germans are just like, no, let's pay the Americans, because ultimately that will cost us less. And of course, if they keep the Americans in Europe, they'll be right.
Until the next time there's a debate around it. But I'm curious about that scenario. Can you map out, let's say they don't lock the Americans in and there's a shock and there's a break in the system, somebody pulls the blanket. What does that look like? The first few months, both on the risks that creates for Europeans, but also the steps they need to take after that.
It depends on when it is, right? I mean, Europeans should see themselves in a reasonably advantageous position right now. I'm writing this paper on, what is the actual military threat to Estonia right now, which is considered to be the most vulnerable part of NATO Europe. And the broad conclusion with a bunch of caveats is, there isn't one, because the Russians are bleeding themselves in Ukraine. And so right now, if someone pulled the security blanket off, they might feel a little bit cold, but they'd have plenty of time to knit a new blanket. When the war in Ukraine ends, which to listen to the Trump administration might be in 2 or 3 weeks, probably will be longer, but I think eventually it will end. The Russians will start to reform, reconstitute. They have a tendency to take around 5, 7, 8 years to sort of, because they do this all the time, to reconstitute their threat. And on a daily basis after the Ukraine war ends, I think their threat will get harder. And if they don't do anything in those 5, 7, 8 years, it will be very cold indeed outside of that blanket. And similarly, just looking at it another way, if they do nothing now and Trump in his 4th term finally pulls the blanket off, then they'll be in big trouble.
ECFR, you guys did a great report. I think it was the end of last year, heading into the Trump administration, looking at the different strains of Trump administration foreign policy thinking. What is winning out right now? I think there's a lot of confusion. What's our China policy? What's our policy toward Europe?
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused as to that too. Just for your listeners' edification, the 3 groups that we identified within the Trump administration were primacists who want America to lead throughout the world, prioritizers who want America to concentrate on Asia, and restrainers who want America to concentrate at home. I think all 3 strains were represented in the Trump administration's selections, and that reflects the fact that Trump didn't pick these people ideologically. In my view, he sort of has restrainer instincts, but he's actually really none of these things. He's sort of a narcissist leavened by financial interests. So all 3 are in there. I think they are all in a sort of battle for Trump's mind on every given issue. And some of them have won on some issues and some of them have won on others. It seems to me that, to my surprise, the prioritizers are really struggling with the China issue, that the restrainers are more winning out on China, and Trump seems very interested in a grand bargain, not really interested in projecting U.S. power into the Western Pacific or defending Taiwan to a degree, which was, we had some inkling of, but I expected those people to be able to move the bureaucracy. The restrainers have proven, particularly in Europe, to be a pretty strong faction, and I think they're very strong in the vice president's office and even in the Pentagon, which I expected to be more prioritizer. The primacists have been nonetheless still pretty strong, and this is particularly true in the Middle East, where the bombing of Iran, even if it only lasted, 12 days or 12 hours, depending on how you look at it, is still quite an extraordinary triumph for them. And I can tell you with great certainty, upset the restrainers and the prioritizers in the administration to no end. So they've been sort of, I wouldn't say dominant, but very successful in the Middle East. And then you have this weird thing, which I didn't really anticipate at all, which is the attention on the Western Hemisphere, which is, I guess, is kind of not restrainer. It's not any of them, really. I used to think of it as restrainer, but the restrainers that I know are very upset about the policy toward Venezuela and Colombia and the fact that there are 10,000 U.S. sailors off the coast of Venezuela bombing cigarette boats for no particular reason. And so that's kind of yet another faction, which seems to be very, very strong. So I think early in the administration, I think we see some tendencies toward restraint and Western Hemisphere, but I think that the primacists and even the prioritizers are hanging tough. They're all in there. They're all winning arguments on some days because Trump changes a lot and the battle for Trump's mind continues.
How do you think those different camps or buckets manifest around the specific issue of Ukraine? Even that has changed from a few months ago to this month to tomorrow, honestly. Even in the interaction with Zelensky, it feels different. I'm not saying the impacts are particularly different because we're not seeing much yet, and we're facing a new Putin-Trump summit in Budapest. But how does that manifest? And have you seen a different way maybe for that particular leader to try to engage the administration differently?
Yeah, well, I mean, the lines of battle on Ukraine were fairly clear within the administration. Obviously, the restrainers and the prioritizers wanted to get out of the Ukraine problem by and large, and the primacists wanted to continue roughly the Biden policy. And I very much expected the restrainers and the prioritizers to be successful because they seem to be leaning in the same direction as the president. The president was sort of saying throughout the campaign and even early into the administration that the Ukrainians were horrible people who had started the war, and that he had a very bad relationship with Zelensky and a very bad relationship with Ukraine because he thought it had interfered in the previous elections, responsible for his impeachment, and probably had something to do with gang violence in New York. But that didn't exactly come to pass. I mean, some of it did. And at the end of the day, they did cut off military aid to Ukraine, which is a big deal. But I think what interfered was that the president, as a sort of manifestation of his narcissism, decided that he wanted to win a Nobel Peace Prize and wanted to define himself as the peace president, and therefore needed to bring peace to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Gaza conflict, the Albania-Azerbaijan conflict, the Cambodia one. I mean, so a lot of different places that weren't necessarily at war yet. I think this has been one of the big themes of his administration. I have to say, it's not a theme that I'm opposed to. It's a good idea to bring peace to these places. And I do think that the United States has sometimes been a little bit more focused on the specific outcome than on peace in some of these places. So broadly, I think it makes some sense, but it has scrambled a lot of the points that I was about that the tribes were making, because his interest in finding a settlement has led him to not detach from the issue as much as possible. And I keep expecting, and I think the key to any successful prediction in this business is to keep doing it until it eventually comes true, that I keep expecting that in the Russia-Ukraine file, he will get frustrated with his lack of success and just drop out. And at that point, my original idea that the restrainer and prioritizer notion will work, and he'll just sort of leave it to Europe and pretend it doesn't exist anymore. That was the template for the North Korean case in the first term. And I think it's a very viable option for the administration. But it hasn't happened yet. He's going to go back and try another bite at that apple soon in Budapest. And so I guess we'll see.
I thought we were there with his Truth Social post from a few weeks ago where he said, "Good luck to all of you," or something like that, which I assumed he was washing his hands and we could sort of move on.
I guess somehow Zelensky and Putin and the Europeans keep dangling in front of him the idea that there's a settlement to be made here.
Yeah, I do wonder, maybe sort of final question, is that it had seemed like the Ukrainians and the Europeans had sort of successfully moved Trump on the conflict to a place where he essentially wasn't going to, quote unquote, do no harm, where the U.S. was going to keep weapons deliveries until the money ran out. The money's all been spent during the Biden years. We'll still provide intel sharing. And then it seemed like the request for tomahawks sort of prompted Putin to come back into action, give Trump a call. And now that seemed to have been effective in moving Trump sort of in a more sort of hostile place towards Ukraine. The question is, these figures like Alexander Stubb of Finland, other European leaders, Starmer of the UK, that have really, in some ways not done what you had suggested, have really tried to appease Trump and really tried to befriend Trump and develop a personal relationship. I guess the question is, what are they going to use that relationship for? And it strikes me as protecting Ukraine. Are they going to use that to then move Trump, or how do you see this playing forward? There's one European official noted to me that during the first term, their leader had sort of buttered up to the president, and that felt very good. But then suddenly they got a call in like the middle of the night asking them to do something that they didn't want to do or couldn't do. And it was suddenly they kind of wish that Trump didn't have their cell phone number. You see this ending badly for these European leaders?
I mean, for sure. I mean, they're never going to be able to cash in on this unless they define cashing in as playing a round of golf. Because no one has ever been able to cash in on a friendship with Trump because he doesn't actually have any. So I just think we should have seen this 100 times before. I mean, I'll give you an example from the very beginning of the first Trump administration. When Trump took office the first time, there was a very unseemly, although normal, rush to be the first your foreign leader to visit him in the White House. And Theresa May, then UK Prime Minister, won that race. And she came to the Oval Office, I think, on February 2nd of 2017. And she had an amazing meeting with Donald Trump. I mean, they walked into the Rose Garden holding hands. They were holding hands. And it was difficult to even watch. Yeah, it was a sweet moment. It was a special relationship. And they both said those words, and the press conference could not have been more lovey-dovey. She got on her plane to fly. She was going to Ankara for some reason. And while she was in the air, Trump's administration released the Muslim ban, which maybe you recall from 2017, which basically said that all sorts of citizens of Muslim-majority countries could not come to the United States. This was an absolute bomb in UK domestic politics because a lot of their citizens have dual citizenship and were affected and were from those countries. He had not mentioned this during their meeting. But what was interesting about it is I think it's hard to say that he was betraying her by doing that. He didn't even think about it. It never came up. Nobody advised him about this. And that's the way that Trump and the Trump administration works. They take this stuff for granted. And the fact that you've pledged 3.5% today doesn't mean that they're not going to ask you to pledge 4%, 5% tomorrow. Canada is on its third renegotiation of the NAFTA pact. I mean, I don't understand when people aren't going to learn this lesson. It just seems so abundantly obvious to me at this point. I mean, what can you say? Stubb and Rutte and Starmer, they're praised all over Europe for their handling of Trump. But I think they're all in and have already, to a certain extent, experienced some very unpleasant surprises.
Jeremy Shapiro, thank you so much for joining us on the Eurofile.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.